What's going on, guys? Hope this video finds you well. So this is the third and final Hashino Persona character tier list that I plan to do on the channel, this time covering the antagonists of Persona 3, 4, and 5. Now, as with the main cast character tier list, there is one character from Persona 4 Arena Ultimax and a few characters from Persona 5 Strikers here, since those are the only two Persona spin-offs I've played. I did opt to exclude a couple of the more minor antagonists in P5. I also opted to exclude Akane due to her involuntary involvement. I just found it to be too difficult to place her among most of these characters who are more or less scum of the earth. And that leads me to a major factor that I'm going to try to incorporate when ranking these guys is their effectiveness as antagonists, and not just my preference towards them as characters, because there are a good number of characters here that I don't really care for that much as characters, but at the same time I can admit that they play the role of antagonist well, which is why I think it'd be especially hard to rank these guys alongside many of the characters from the previous two tier lists. Let's go ahead and go through the criteria for the tiers. S tier is going to be characters that I both enjoy from a character standpoint, alongside them being effective antagonists. A tier is going to be for characters that may be effective antagonists, but my mind doesn't jump to them when I think favorite characters, even amongst this pool. B tier are going to be characters that are kind of the baseline for what an antagonist should be. They serve their role well, but not necessarily in a notable way. C tier is going to be for the forgettable and or underwhelming antagonists, but maybe I don't despise them or their implementation necessarily, but they're just kind of whatever, which in this list case is pretty bad in the grand scheme of things. D tier is going to be like actual dog shit characters that I very much don't like, whether them as a character or them as an antagonist or both. And so I figure since there are quite a few more Persona 5 characters than 3 and 4, let's go ahead and knock some of those out first. So we've got Kamoshida. As a character, I wouldn't say that I necessarily care for Kamoshida that much, but his role in the story and his service as an obstacle to the Phantom Thieves is very well done, all things considered. I did largely break down each of the scenarios in Persona 3, 4, and 5 in my dedicated discussion videos on those, so to maybe save a little bit of time, I won't always kind of give the rundown of their role in the story, especially because if you're watching this, you've probably played the games anyway. So yeah, we all know that Kamoshida's past with Ryoji and current situation with An lead to it being a very personal problem, and then of course Ren gets roped into that, and there's the risk of him getting in further trouble than he already is since he's on some kind of probation or whatever it was. Relatively low stakes in the grand scheme of things, but because of the personal and character focused nature of this first arc, it makes the stakes feel a lot higher than they are in the grand scheme of world-ending RPG scenarios that are out there, right? So yeah, Kamoshida lands cleanly in the A tier. Madarame, I would say, is similarly effective to Kamoshida. I am a little torn if I would put him a tier below, though, because I don't think he is quite as effective, but it's a similar scenario where Yusuke is very close to Madarame. Even though Yusuke isn't a member of the Phantom Thieves at the start of the arc, the other three who get roped in to Yusuke and Madarame's world via Yusuke wanting to paint on does more intimately connect the existing Phantom Thieves into Madarame's sham, and obviously breaking Yusuke out of that situation. And so I'd say Madarame is an effective antagonist for that arc in the game, mostly in service to Yusuke's character arc though. So I wouldn't say that that necessarily speaks to Madarame as a character or an individual. And while his crimes are very detestable, I do think that Kamoshida maybe feels like more of a threat because his actions are concurrent with the story, whereas Madarame's mostly took place in the past, or at least his most egregious crimes took place in the past. And he's been kind of riding the coattails of the unwarranted success he found since then. So yeah, I would say Madarame is kind of on the cusp between B and A. I'm gonna put him in B just for now, kind of see where other characters fall. Kaneshiro is pretty forgettable. He lacks that personal connection to any of the main cast. Makoto kind of just randomly gets involved with this guy by brazenly trying to expose his drug ring or whatever's going on in Shibuya during that arc. And just generally, Kaneshiro doesn't get a lot of screen time anyway, and even then, what screen time he does get is not particularly interesting either. I do think his metaverse form is mildly entertaining, but not enough to keep him out of the lower tiers. I'm gonna put him in C, because I don't absolutely despise this guy, but he is very forgettable and not particularly impactful either. This is the point in Persona 5 where the story arcs start to focus less on the antagonists themselves and more on what they represent in society, so there is that, but I don't think that's an excuse for poor characterization. I feel like Okumura is similarly underwhelming to Kaneshiro, though he does have a direct tie to Haru, of course. That arc in the game is very messy, though, with all of the different things that happen that don't necessarily feel related, like Morgana and Ryoji arguing, and so that's how Morgana stumbles upon Haru. I think because of the messiness of that arc, it doesn't really give Okumura a chance to shine. I think that there was definitely potential with him because of the grander scheme that he is a part of and his connection to Haru, but he just kind of falls flat to me as an antagonist. I don't think he gets particularly a lot of screen time. He's unceremoniously killed. There's like no shock value to his death, so you don't even have that going for him because the story of Persona 5 refuses to leave anything to the imagination. Having Akechi, even though you don't know it's Akechi, kill Okumura on screen really just takes all of the impact out of seeing him die at that press conference. I really don't like that storytelling angle in P5, which occurs multiple times throughout that game. I believe I talked more on this in my previous video on it though, so go check that out if you want more details. I lump him in with Kaneshiro as being kind of forgettable. Now let's move up into the Persona 4 category real quick. We got Mitsuo Kubo, who is the main red herring in Persona 4's murder mystery story. And I think as a red herring, he actually does pretty decently. He's a real shithead, but in a way that at least evokes some kind of emotion out of me, where I feel that frustration and hatred towards him from Kanji and Yosuke in particular. And while in the grand scheme of Persona 4's story, he's not particularly important, he's just kind of a random disruption to the mystery at hand, and is very much meant to distract you from who the killer could actually be. I know, at least for me, playing through P4G for the first time, Moruka was actually one of the prime suspects to me, and the fact that he is killed by Kubo, of course, eliminates him from the equation. He's at least memorable in the way that he impacts Persona 4's story, even if, again, at the end of the day, it's not like super consequential, especially on a replay when you know he's not the killer and when you know Maruka's not the killer. Or I guess Kubo is a killer, but he's not the main culprit for this series of kidnappings. He's kind of on the cusp between C and B for me, because I don't think he's as forgettable and bland as the current C tier characters, but I also don't think that he's as effective as Madarame necessarily, which maybe means Madarame needs to be an A tier, or we just consider Kubo to be sort of a novelty B tier. He actually does serve the role of at least antagonist for that arc decently well because of how much of a scumbag he is. I think that maybe at least barely justifies me putting him in B tier, but then I think maybe Madarame actually does deserve to be an A, and that does have me considering Kamoshida for S tier. It's just, like I said before, as a character, I wouldn't say Kamoshida is particularly notable for me. Now, while I did eliminate Akane from this list, who is an involuntary monarch in Persona 5 Strikers, Namatame is similarly an involuntary antagonist, but in a different way where it's not really done without his knowing. He genuinely thinks that he is saving these people, whereas he's actually the one who is doing these kidnappings, as opposed to the true culprit who decided to use Namatame to try to keep his hands clean. It was actually kind of genius, because Namatame, of course, is tied in with the case, because there was that whole cheating scandal early on in the game. I will say that scandal at the beginning seems completely inconsequential on a first play, to the point where when Namatame became prevalent in the story again, I was like so confused as to who this guy was. I had almost no recollection. And yeah, on a replay, I did take note of those few spots where you can see him or his truck around town. It's not very often, but it is there. It also had me paying attention more to the scandal stuff at the beginning of the game. I do think that's maybe kind of the point, is that this scandal seems inconsequential at first glance, sort of like when you hear about tragedies on the news that are not within your vicinity, but then once something like that happens within your vicinity, it feels a lot more real and dangerous in that way. Maybe that's kind of the intent, is that since Inaba's a small town, these kinds of scandals are more interesting to people because there's just not a lot going on. But then once these murders do get brought into Inaba, that's when the stakes feel a lot higher. So I wonder if that scandal is intended to be viewed as superfluous to a first-time player, and then it's something you can pay attention to and dig into a little more on following playthroughs. Not that it's still the most interesting thing ever, but it has more bearing on the story than you would think at first glance. Especially having played through P4G twice, I think that if I was basing this entirely off my first playthrough, I'd put him pretty low. Yeah, I'm not wild about Namatame as a character, he's kind of whatever, but his role in the story is enough to probably warrant B tier alongside Kubo. Let's do the monarchs from Persona 5 Strikers. So we've got Alice, Ango, and Mariko, each of which serve as antagonists for the first 3 arcs in P5S, but also kind of reflect or almost serve as a foil to particular Phantom Thieves. With Alice, it's Ango, it's Yusuke, and Mariko, it's Haru. I think generally the monarchs and strikers do a better job than the palace rulers in vanilla P5 P5 or Royal, because not only do you have the context of the character arcs for the Phantom Thieves previously and why these antagonists combat them idealistically, but just generally having that more personal focus, I think does a lot. Alice has somewhat similar trauma to Ann, and they also are in somewhat of a similar field. I think Alice is some kind of pop idol or something, whereas Ann is a model. Ann sees that Alice is hurt. The lesson there is to not hurt people in turn because of your past traumas. With Ongo, it's about artistic integrity, but because of the plagiarism aspect to Madarame, whom Yusuke looked up to for much of his life, he takes a lot of pride in the art that he makes being his own, whereas Ongo is just kind of amalgamating a bunch of plagiarized aspects from other fantasy novels into his own, which does give it a wide market appeal as seen by his success with his books or whatever, but also makes them incredibly generic. You do of course have the whole Emma kind of brainwashing sort of elements going on there too that are kind of multiplying the effectiveness of these very generic but wide market appeal books that Ongo seems to be writing. And plus he's just kind of a snide bastard, which I find enjoyable. And then Mariko I think is probably the weakest of these three, being a family friend of Haru's from when she was young. The thing with Mariko is that she is trying to stomp out this corruption, but she's doing it with an iron fist, and so therefore treating her subordinates very poorly. It's a noble cause, but the means by which she is executing that cause is not good, which leaves Mariko being a little bit different than Alice and Ongo, who are intentionally being malicious. With Alice's manipulation of her perception, like when she brainwashes that guy with Emma to confess his love for her on the air even though he's engaged or something like that. Ongo with taking pride in his success even though it's not really his success for multiple reasons. Now I do think that makes Mariko feel maybe a tad weaker than the other two, maybe among other things that I can't quite recall, but maybe that's a factor as well, is that Mariko is maybe a little less memorable than the first two, but I would at the very least put these guys at the higher end of B. I don't know that they're quite as memorable as Kamoshida and Madarame. Maybe Mariko is more like a C tier though. I think that her relation to Haru is positive in that Haru gets more screen time and more of a focus for an arc that is way earlier on in the game compared to her presence in P5, Vanilla, and Royal. But that speaks way more on Haru than it does on Mariko. She does a decent job, but just like notably weaker than Alice and Ongo, I think. I've always found Ikutsuki to be underwhelming as an antagonist, and even as a character I'm not super wild about him. Like he's kind of the quirky guy who is obsessed with puns or whatever, and that's a fine facade I suppose, but I was never really convinced by his importance early on, at least when I was first playing through FES. He is involved with the Kirijo group, and because he's the chairman of Gekkoukan High School, it allows for him to be the sponsor for C's, which I always forget is, I think, an official club in Gekkoukan's records, but no one knows what they actually do. It allows for the members of C's to live in the same dorm, which is important for executing dark hour operations and all that. And so that's obviously there, and his knowledge is important as well, even though he is manipulating C's. And a factor that I find interesting and that I feel is a little ambiguous, at least in the games themselves, is the information game between Ikutsuki, C's, and Strega. Ikutsuki is keeping C's in the dark and straight up lying to them. He tells them you have to defeat the 12 full moon shadows to stop the dark hour, but that actually is what leads to the end of the world and does not eliminate the dark hour after all. What's unclear to me, but in kind of a cool way, is how much Strega knows relative to Ikutsuki. So there's two potential angles here that could either strengthen or weaken the effectiveness of Ikutsuki and Strega in my eyes. One scenario is that Ikutsuki is lying to Strega and is telling them, hey, if C's defeats the full moon shadows, the dark hour ends, you lose your powers, and you still die young because fuck you. In which case that strengthens Ikutsuki's position, but it does weaken Strega. You would assume that once C's eliminates the full moon shadows, Ikutsuki then informs Strega, or Strega comes to the conclusions themselves since the dark hour isn't gone, that the dark hour isn't gone, and that this actually will bring about the fall. What I think is maybe more likely, which actually strengthens Strega in my eyes, is that Strega knows that defeating the full moon shadows brings about what they want, which is the end of the world, because it's very much a they've lived a tortured existence, they're gonna die young, so they want to take the rest of the world with them kind of deal. But if Strega knows that C's defeating the full moon shadows would bring about the fall, then that means that them standing as an obstacle to C's is actually a means to further motivate C's to defeat the full moon shadows. They're motivated already to do this as a group and as individuals as the game goes on, but Strega stepping in their way, not only ensuring that C's is capable of taking on these shadows, but also giving them an external motivation to do so. And then Shinji ends up being kind of collateral damage because of that. It's tricky too because Takuya shoots Shinji, or well, he was gonna shoot Ken, right? He's trying to shoot Ken because he thinks Ken is the navigator for C's because Ken says so. So that is maybe an indicator that Strega doesn't know that and Ikutsuki is lying to them about the Dark Hour disappearing once those full moon shadows are killed. And so then in that case, Strega is legitimately trying to stop Seize and not just trying to motivate them. But then again, I wouldn't put it past Takuya wanting an excuse to kill a member or two of Seize just because. I don't know if there's supplemental material out there that clarifies this. I also don't know that this is something that gets brought up very often when discussing Ikutsuki and Strega. Obviously, Ikutsuki knows the actual truth, but how much of that information is he feeding to Strega, and how much of that is being solved by Strega on their own? I would maybe have hoped that that would have been explored more in Reload. And sure, the extra screen time from Strega does help. I mean, Chidori's role in the story is more or less the same. Jin gets just a little bit more screen time. Mostly it's his loyalty to Takuya that's focused on, but we don't really know why that's the case. I don't think we really necessarily need to know why. We know that they've been through some traumatic shit based on them getting experimented on for them to have personas, and said personas are literally killing them because of that artificial experimentation and all that, which would almost make you think that if the Dark Hour is eliminated and they lose their persona abilities, that the limited lifespan would also be removed, but I don't know exactly how true that is. Because of course Chidori dying and then coming back to life via the life force that she emitted through those flowers, when she comes back, it's said that she lost her memory of everything after awakening to her persona, and I'm assuming the experimentation and all that would also fall into that category, but also that she's no longer dying because she doesn't have her persona anymore. It is one of those that I think is maybe better left ambiguous because it makes it a lot more interesting than if they did outright state it. If we're under the assumption that Ikutsuki is kind of manipulating both Seize and Strega, I think that strengthens him as an antagonist, though I do feel like the twist betrayal does very much come out of nowhere. But at the same time, his impact on the story is pretty important because he kills Mitsuru's dad, which pushes her arc forward, and him killing himself alongside Mitsuru's dad leaves Seize completely without an authority figure directly, no one to report to, no one to question what they should do next. They have to figure things out for themselves, which pushes all of their character arcs forward individually and even as a group. So as a plot device, Ikutsuki serves the story of P3 really well, but as a character and as an antagonist, I could maybe justify B tier just because of the information game and his impact on the story and the other characters, which is all really good shit, but because of him as an individual not being that excellently executed, I would probably put him just above Namatame or something. Like, sure, he is more important to P3's story than Alice and Ongo are to P5S's story, but I think that for their role as just random arc villains, as opposed to being a puppet master, I feel like they do well. And then Ikutsuki as kind of a puppet master is like not that amazingly presented, at least. And I'd say that the rest of Strega, yes, as main antagonists, they are a little on the weak side overall as a group, but I could at least justify giving them the baseline antagonist points. Chidori, of course, is only an antagonist temporarily, whereas Jin and Takuya are antagonists to the very end. I mean, Jin literally blows himself up. That was less to help Seize and more to prevent his own demise at the hands of shadows. He wanted to go out on his own terms. Chidori can definitely cut a higher B ranking. I think Jin is easily the weakest of the three as far as just characterization generally, but at the same time, at least he's memorable to some effect compared to someone like Namatame, for instance, who's mostly where he's placed because of his narrative role as opposed to him as a character as well. So I feel like Jin in C is a little harsh, but I could also maybe see it. So I think I'd probably put him like kind of middle of B or something like that. I don't know what it is about Takuya that I've not been super wild about him, because I do think that the added scenes with him in Reload do help flesh out his motivations a little bit more, even though they were pretty clear in Fest. He gets to at least talk with Makoto a few times, and that kind of gives them more of a personal reason to push back against each other. I still don't think it's amazingly done, but I will say that I think P3's narrative is more so compelling because of how character driven it is from the main cast side of things. I almost kind of view the main antagonist of Persona 3 as being the internal strife between the group and death as a concept, as opposed to the individual characters who are standing in their way. But that said, I could maybe justify giving Takuya the A tier here. Maybe it's a little bit generous, but the more I think about Takuya and his role in the story, the more he's starting to grow on me a little bit. Shido, for being the big bad, at least character-wise, because, like, is Yaldabaoth really a character? Him being Akechi's dad, there's some personal connection there, I guess, because Akechi's not really a member of the Phantom Thieves, so there's that, but you also do get to know him pretty well, especially if you do his confidant in Royal specifically. As a big bad, I think Shido is kind of more so in that, maybe not forgettable realm, but just not particularly effective as an antagonist, I think, especially so for his role in the story. I'm not really convinced by him. I could maybe justify giving him the top of C tier or something. I think think because Shido is more or less the final boss of P5, makes him slightly more memorable than Kaneshiro and Okumura, but pretty much only because of that. If you strip away his final boss status, which he, again, technically isn't, then he's probably just as forgettable and uninteresting as those other two. Yaldabaoth kind of sucks. I do think it's clever the way they weaved in the voice actor change for Igor, at least with the Japanese voices. He has like a really deep voice, which is very unlike how Igor typically sounds. And so to begin with, you might just think, oh, P5's taking a different direction. Or maybe if you knew about the voice actor passing away, then it's like, oh, they're just taking a completely new direction for Igor. But Igor's not that fleshed out of a character to want to do something major like that, I think. Obviously, because it's not Igor and it's Yaldabaoth, it does make more sense. Yeah, I'm just not really a big fan of the godlike figure coming in at the 11th hour thing that these games tend to do. Primarily in P4 and 5, I think the way P3 handles it is actually pretty good, which we'll get into in a sec. But yeah, Yaldabaoth, that's a D tier, I think. It's a trope that I'm tired of seeing in Persona, even execution-wise, because you can execute tropes well, or at least do something to shake up a trope to make it a little bit less cliche. I guess speaking of godlike beings that come in at the 11th hour, we have Izanami, who I also think is very poorly done. Why does the gas station attendant not have a portrait? I don't understand. Not only would that have helped make them feel like an actual character, but it also could have been another red herring for the murder mystery. There's so many characters in P4 that don't have portraits, and you would figure that if the culprit is someone that you know, it would be someone with a portrait, right? Wouldn't really make sense for them not to, which makes Adachi, especially in vanilla P4, very obvious, especially because he doesn't have a social link in that version. So yeah, P4 remake, whenever that happens, give the gas station attendant a portrait, maybe make Izanami not come out of left field so shittily. And like, yeah, thematically, okay, it makes sense, because like, use persona, or at least his canon persona, his original persona is Izanagi, if Izanami on the opposite side of that. And yeah, Izanami, to kind of test humanity or whatever, gave the power of personas to Adachi, Yu, and Namatame, but Namatame doesn't really have a persona in the same way, but I think it's maybe because of a lack of confidence or like whatever. He does transform into like, you know, kind of the shadow manipulated version of his persona, but he doesn't gain a persona after you defeat him. Doesn't really matter that much. Izanami kind of sucks. I'd probably put them above Yaldabaoth. And then to round out the characters that represent the godlike final bosses, we have Ryoji, who is an actual character. And sure, he is presented as Pharos, the kind of story-based Death Arcana social link. It's not until the late game, once you max that link and defeat all the full moon shadows, that Ryoji actually shows up. But there is some connection there. You do learn after the fact that he is the 13th full moon shadow, Thanatos, and that he was sealed inside Makoto by Aigis when Makoto's family was in that car crash that killed his parents. So there is much more of a connection there. I know Ryoji is only really present for, what, about a month or so in Persona 3. You know, once he learns what he really is and what he has to do outside of his own control, he does inform C's about this because he doesn't want to do this, because he has gained some sort of humanity from being sealed inside of Makoto and talking with him and all of that, which I think is pretty poignant. I like that. I wouldn't say that Ryoji is necessarily like an S tier character for me, but I do think that he serves his role in the story pretty well. I do think that because there is some build up towards a big bad, such as Nyx or Nyx Avatar in this case, that I actually quite like that revelation in P3 compared to 4 and 5. And at the same time, despite Ryoji slash Nyx Avatar or whatever being the final boss and not necessarily being like an automatic S tier, I do think that it's more so what the Nyx Avatar and Nyx represent, being death and the end of the world, are more important than the quote-unquote character of Nyx themselves, since that is technically the equivalent of Izanami and Yaldabaoth. It's less so the specific entity or character quote-unquote of Nyx than it is the representation of death. I think if Taki is A tier, then Ryoji can be A tier as well. Sort of involuntary as an antagonist in that he doesn't want to summon Nyx, but he knows that it's like in his DNA or whatever shadows have to do so. He doesn't really have a choice in the matter, but he chooses to inform Z's so that they at least have a chance to fight back, even though he knows or at least thinks that it would be fruitless. And it is only really because Makoto sacrifices himself that Nyx is able to be stopped, which is kind of crazy. So like, yeah, it actually was technically impossible for Z's to defeat Nyx, in the traditional sense at least. Let's go ahead and do the remaining P5S antagonists first. So we have Konoe, who is kind of the fake out main antagonist of P5S. He's basically Tony Stark, so that's cool. He does get some screen time here and there as being the spokesperson for, I don't remember the name of it, but whatever tech company he runs that created Emma. He's kind of pulling the strings and like trying to exert control to some effect. I don't know if he was doing it as a means to empower these individuals who had traumas in their past, which is something I didn't mention about the Monarchs in P5S, is that their traumas and their past and their motivations, or like why why they are the way they are explored much more deeply than in P5R. I do think that sometimes pulling the sympathetic villain card too late can seem cheap and not effective, but I think it's actually handled pretty well in Strikers, all things considered. I really can't tell you very much about Konoe though, because like he's not actually the big bad. Yeah, his design in his fight is cool because, you know, you got the Iron Man kind of thing going on, which is cool, but I genuinely couldn't tell you anything about him off the top of my head. I would maybe say that his tragic backstory is pulled a little bit too late, considering he does show up throughout the game as opposed to just being a villain for a specific arc. As a character, I just couldn't really tell you very much about him, so I think that's C tier worthy. There definitely is some tragic shit where I want to say his parents or one of his parents was killed in front of him or something because of their ties to some shady organizations or debt collection kinds of stuff, and so he made it his life's mission to accumulate wealth and try to treat people fairly or something. I don't really put too much stock into Konoe as a character. Ichinose, on the other hand, I think was a pretty well done twist villain. I remember when she first showed up, I assumed she was going to be the monarch for whatever town you happen to be going to next. That's what would make the most sense to me. A new character is introduced with a portrait at the start of a new arc, you know, usually pretty obvious that that is the next big bad, which is kind of the problem with a lot of arc-based RPG stories. The unique character model is here, the unique portrait is here. Usually, clearly, this is the next villain because that's how these things go, right? But then Ichinose turns out to actually help out the Phantom Thieves for the majority of the game's runtime. And it's not until later on in the game that it is revealed that she was the original creator of Emma and that her ultimate goal actually was to kind of brainwash everybody into being equal and kind of eliminate conflict amongst humanity. But then, of course, there's the whole message of stripping people of their individuality and their capability to make mistakes. It's just like sapping all the free will from people, of course. And so that's not really the greatest way to go about it. Ichinose does realize prior to the final boss that her methodology and her reasoning was wrong. I think it's because she just was a very stoic individual and was made fun of for being someone who doesn't really express emotion very much. And that kind of scarred her into looking for an artificial companion, which was Sophia. But then Sophia ended up having more of a heart than Ichinose felt like she had herself, because her heart, metaphorically speaking, was hardened over time through the bullying and all of that, ultimately creating Emma, which obviously was capable of creating these monarchs and all this brainwashing and desire stealing and all that. Once Sophia awakens to her true persona towards the very end of the game, it's kind of too late, and Emma is too powerful for Ichinose to stop, even if she wanted to, and so the Phantom Thieves have to take down Emma themselves. I think Ichinose is A tier worthy, actually. Maybe kind of on the lower end of A tier. Not only was the twist pretty effective, but I think her role as an antagonist was effective, and her motivations checked out, even though her methodology was flawed for sure. But also, isn't that kind of the point of many antagonists in media, is that you can easily point to flawed methodology, even if putting yourself in their shoes makes it possible to see where they're coming from? I think Ichinose falls into that category. Let's do the sole Persona 4 Arena Ultimax character being Sho. I ripped into this guy like there's no tomorrow in my dedicated Arena Ultimax video, so if you want details, you can go check that out. But basically it boils down to, don't like his design, he's obnoxious as a character, and his role in the story fucking sucks, and even retroactively hurts Persona 4's story if you consider Arena Ultimax canon or put a lot of stock into it, because apparently he was there for the events of P4, which is really, really dumb. I would maybe justify creating an F tier or something for him, but I'm just gonna put him in D. Just know that this is like a whole nother level of distaste compared to the shitty god final boss implementation of Yaldabaoth and Izanami. Last but not least, I'm just gonna say it outright, we've got the two S tier characters on this list being Adachi and Maruki. Do I even really need to say much? Not really, because I did talk about Adachi in my P4G video, and I think I talked about Maruki in my P5R video, but maybe not as in depth. Adachi is just a really enjoyably hateable antagonist. Maybe I had like an inkling that he would have been the big bad, but I think it's something that I probably wrote off as being a possibility a certain ways into the story until eventually it becomes more obvious later on. But he's so unassuming on the surface, and I think that makes that twist and his removal of his facade at a certain point very cathartic in a way. Even though his worldview is extremely flawed, he puts a lot of blame for things that he has control of on society in general, which, yeah, maybe there is an inkling of truth there, but what he's willing to do because of that worldview is just not justified in the slightest. I really like Adachi a lot. Easily one of the strongest aspects to P4, and that would justify putting him in the S tier. In a series of games that has as middling and weak antagonists as the Hoshino Persona games, Adachi stands out far and above pretty much all of them. And then we have Maruki. I think his implementation was really well done as a psychiatrist who was brought in to talk to the victims of Kamoshida. It just makes a lot of sense. It feels very natural. So that's a plus compared to a lot of Atlas re-release characters. I think that his confidant presents a lot of interesting moral dilemmas and gives a lot of food for thought as well. He's a genuine genuinely sympathetic and likable character, first and foremost. And it's only if Ren does his confidant fully that Maruki is able to figure out how to create this ideal reality where people don't have to suffer, which is very strangely similar to Ichinose. I know P5R and P5S were in development around the same time, but it is interesting how similar their motivations and kind of end goals were, even if they are somewhat different. In Maruki's world, people seemingly have some kind of free will, but it's not the reality that they lived through. It's kind of each individual's constructed ideal reality is being fulfilled simultaneously. There is a similar message there of if you strip away all adversity and everything is just like perfect for you, then what's even necessarily the point of living a life like that? It could feel so stagnant and predictable, but at the same time, unless you had someone to kind of snap you out of things, I feel like it would be easy to say from the inside that this ideal reality thing is fine, but from the outside looking in, I feel like it's a little bit easier to scrutinize. But it definitely is very morally gray in this case, more so than Ichinose's end goal, which was kind of achieving a similar thing but through brainwashing, so that's like even worse because there's no free will, there's like no pleasure to be taken in that either. I guess it would just be people like robotically serving their function in society versus Maruki's reality where you can at least still be your own person, it's just not actually representative of your past experiences and all of that. Yeah, it's an interesting kind of moral quandary that's presented with Maruki's ideal reality. What I think is most interesting perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't think he brings back his former fiance or whatever she was, which I find interesting. I think that very much indicates that he's not doing this for himself, because you would think that Maruki's ideal reality would have her in his life, but I would assume that because he came to terms with that years ago, he's doing this more so for people like Yoshizawa, who is currently suffering from the identity crisis and all of that, and putting her mind at ease. But then again, isn't Yoshizawa's ideal reality her being her sister as opposed to her sister being still alive? Maybe that has to do with the prior spell or whatever that Maruki cast on her prior to this ideal reality setting in fully. Really good shit. I do think that there are some storytelling blunders in the third semester that plague pretty much all of P5. It's kind of a shame that that does seep in, but again, I went into that in my previous P5R video, so I'm not going to discuss it here. But Maruki as a character in this, an antagonist, and his motivations, him achieving actually what he set out to do, and being challenged on his worldview makes him easily an S tier on this list. I think because of how thought-provoking his whole perspective is, I would put him probably above Adachi, but they're both in the S tier relative to the rest of these characters for sure. I think this is pretty representative of how I feel about most of these guys. Go ahead and let me know what you think. Who are your favorite antagonists on this list? Based on the usual discussions around Persona antagonists, I can't imagine that anyone who is placed particularly low on this list is anyone's favorite, but you just never know. I think for the foreseeable future, these three tier lists are going to be representative of my thoughts on the characters across these games, even if there is a possibility way down the road for me redoing them to some effect. Hard to say what the next Persona related video specifically would be. I'm kind of at the point of waiting for re-releases of many of these games as opposed to going out of my way to play them through emulation. So that is always a possibility if that whim ever strikes me. And then of course we have Persona 6 to look forward to whenever that gets announced, and that'll inject some lifeblood into the Persona discussion. Although of course there's other non-Persona Mega 10 stuff and Meta 4 coming out later this year as well. I do of course want to thank my channel members and shout out the Space Cowboy at the Super Shadow Operative tier. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe of course if you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next video.